The reading is from Exodus chapter 17 and 18. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and went up to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, "My father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh." Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, "I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons." So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, that's some story, isn't it? Today, we're looking at chapters 17 and 18 of our journey through the book of Exodus. We're nearly halfway through this amazing story, and the children of Israel have now left Egypt, and they're going on their journey to the Promised Land. So now I'm going to give you another spoiler. So close your ears if you don't want to know the end. They get there. But, there's always a but, isn't there? But not for a long while yet. In fact, we'll have to go right through this book and 3 more books to finally see them, to get to the land God promised they would inherit. So, why was this? And what did God have to do to get these people ready for their inheritance? Okay, let's have a look at what happened next. So Moses, as we know, was called to lead. Next slide, please. I've split the chapters, 17 and 18, into 3 parts. Firstly, confrontation from the inside. Next, confrontation from the outside. And finally, disorganization. So we have 2 confrontations and a disorganization. That's not a very good start for Moses, is it? God has got his people out of their slavery. But there were 2 things that he had to do. He had not only to get the people out of Egypt, but he also had to get Egypt out of the people. After all, these people have been living in the land of Egypt for over 400 years. And although they weren't Egyptian, some of the customs and attitudes and values of that nation would have been incorporated into their daily lives by now. It's one thing to take the people out of Egypt, it's quite another to take Egypt out of the hearts of the people. I think we too can relate to that. If we've been saved and we have been taken from the world, that's one thing. But it's quite another thing to have the world with its values, its love, its pleasure, taken out of our hearts. And that is a recurring theme that we will see in this story of the wanderings of God's people throughout the Old Testament. We heard how they'd complained before in last week. Now it's happening again. They're going down the same road. I wonder if Moses had had a theme song back then, what would it have been? On the road again, or maybe the long and winding road, since they were just going around and around the same road for 40 years. Or perhaps a better song for both Moses and the Israelites themselves would have been, I can't get no satisfaction. It just seemed that on this incredible long camping trip through the wilderness, that the people never stay satisfied for very long. Not only are they not satisfied, but Moses, it tells us, is not satisfied with their behavior. So let's start at the beginning of chapter 17. Along this road, we encounter two separate hazards, the confrontation and the disorganisation. These are current themes in everyone's lives: confrontation and disorganisation. We can all relate to these at some time in our lives today. What we read in these chapters has an application for all of us, a sort of study in human nature itself. So firstly, let's look at the confrontation that Moses had to take on. And as I said before, this can be divided into two parts: conflict from the inside, that is, his own people, and conflict from the outside, from another Middle Eastern nation. Last week we saw that the children of Israel were complaining because they had no food. Now they've gone further on in their journey, travelling from place to place, and they come to this place called Rephidim. And there was no water. Now, you might think in a desert, that's not surprising. But this ancient word Rephidim can be translated as a rest stop, like a mini oasis. This place apparently is still there today in the Upper Sinai area. It's a small part of a large oasis, and it has what they call this wadi, or watering hole, as its upper part of that oasis. So just imagine if you were on a long journey, perhaps on a very long motorway, and you'd stopped at a service station, a rest stop. There you'd expect to find water, drinks, food, and restrooms to refresh yourselves. But have you ever stopped at one of these places and found nothing to drink, and the rest areas are closed? No refreshment at all. This is what happened at Rephidim. There was no water, no refreshment. It was closed, locked up, no rest. So the people complained to Moses. Now, here's an interesting point. Talking about complaining, if you look up the complaining of the Israelites in the Old Testament, it is mentioned 8 times. Once in Joshua, once in the Psalms, and all of the rest, the other 6 times, they're found in the books of Exodus and Numbers, their wanderings through the desert. There's 3 times in each book. So most of the time, the attitude of complaining is in this wilderness experience. So they complained, or quarrelled, as the NIV puts it, to Moses. His reply, though, was to ask them why they were testing the Lord. The Hebrew word used in the original here, nasar, means to test, to see if someone is faithful or not, to prove a person, to see if they will act in a certain way. They complained against Moses, but it was actually testing God. But why would they do that? Let's just think back to what has happened before. God brought them out of slavery. God opened the Red Sea so they could walk through it on dry land. God had given them daily bread. God had sent them meat to eat, the quails. God had even given them their own guidance system, the cloud and the pillar of fire, so they wouldn't get lost on their journey. That was way before we had any sat-nav invented. God did all this just to let them die in the wilderness? No, of course not. But that's what they thought. They just complained. These people had so quickly forgotten what God had already done for them. How short our memories are. The human instinct had unfortunately taken over. That self-preservation is a very strong impulse. Do you remember what we read in the book of Job, where Satan comes to God and God says to him, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Satan then hits the nail right on the head when he says, skin for skin. He'd got the human desire for self-preservation just right. Man will do almost anything to save his own life. So they complained to Moses, but Moses did the right thing. He brought the request to God. What he says to the Lord is quite eye-opening. Listen again to what it says in verse 4. What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. The Israelites had seen all the miracles performed, and yet they were still ready to kill the leader that God has used to lead them thus far. How quickly they'd forgotten the sacrifices of their leaders up to this point. A good way to measure spiritual growth, which can be applied both to the Israelites then and to us today, is to look at how we act under certain circumstances. Now, I don't mean when we're in church or when life is good and everything's going fine. That's not a test of spiritual growth. The true test is how we act when things aren't going very good. When the water dries up. When there's no food. When perhaps our earnings go down. Or if we even lose employment. When relationships are torn apart. The Israelites were showing their lack of spiritual growth. They were blaming Moses. What are you going to do? They said to him. Rather than trusting in the omnipotent, all-wise God, they fall back on their human nature and blame someone else. By now, these Israelites had grown into a big nation, and they remembered what their fathers did. They always refer back to what Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who was renamed Israel, did. And it was passed down from generation to generation. So they had no excuse of not knowing who God was and how omnipotent he was. I mean, we read in Revelation of how the angels and the archangels and the seraphims and everyone worships God. These people had been worshipping God for years. And now they were testing God. So they complain. And what does Moses do? He goes straight to God. In the book of James, it tells us, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God who freely gives. Do any of you lack wisdom? I'll put my hand up first. I'm easily lacking wisdom all the time. We need wisdom. We need the wisdom of God. So they have a problem and they bring it to Moses. And Moses wisely takes it to the Lord, saying, I have a problem. I need wisdom. So what do I do? Now God directs him. We look at verses 5 and 6. Moses is told to take the staff, the one which was an instrument of God's judgment, now becomes an instrument of God's mercy. He is told to strike the rock that God leads him to, so that water will come out for them all to drink. Now, just think for a moment here. Moses is considered to be the lawgiver and the deliverer by the Jews, the one that God used to deliver them from bondage. However, this is the one they want to kill. Does that strike a chord? Does it remind you of anything in the New Testament? Jesus Christ himself. Here in the passage, Moses is almost like a type of Christ. We read that Christ came to his own, but they did not receive him. He came as a deliverer, and they wanted to kill him. They said, we will not have this man to rule over us. So what does Jesus do? He commits himself to God. Into your hands I commit my spirit, Jesus said on the cross. So Moses does what God tells him to do. He strikes the rock. Now think again. In the New Testament, Christ is described as a rock, or the rock. We read in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4, where Paul is talking about the people of Israel back in Exodus, and he says, "For they all drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied or followed them, and that what rock was Christ." So why this picture of God and Christ being a rock? Well, firstly, obviously a rock is very stable. It will not fall. Do you remember the story that we told? Jesus told us a parable in the New Testament about the wise man and the foolish man building their houses. And what did the wise man do? He built it on the rock so that when the storm came, the house wouldn't fall. The foolish man didn't build on the rock, and his house fell. The Lord is my rock, is what David said in the Psalms. And also, after Jesus said to Peter, after Peter had told him who he thought he was, Jesus said, "Upon this rock will I build my church." Many people think that was talking about Peter being the rock. But no, he was just a little pebble. He was talking about himself. Upon the rock of Christ will he build his church. The rock is stable. The rock is strong. The rock will not be toppled. Secondly, Moses struck the rod with the staff, the one that originally had been thrown down and became a serpent in front of Pharaoh. Think back now to the beginning when we read in Genesis where a promise was made that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. But the serpent will bruise the seed or saviour of the woman. This was Christ being foretold just after the fall. Christ was put on a cross, bruised by Satan, who didn't know that in doing that, that would crush Satan's power and dominion ultimately. Okay, so back to the story. What happens next? We have seen the conflict that Moses had on the inside with the people complaining. Now the conflict turns to the outside. Verses 8 to the end of this chapter. This is a Middle East conflict, the Amalekites. Who are they? This was a tribe of nomadic people, a ferocious fighting tribe, descended from Amalek. And who was Amalek, you might say? He was the grandson of Esau. Remember Esau? We'll call him the man of flesh. He sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. Not interested in spiritual birthright, he was only interested in gratifying the flesh. I'm hungry, I'll have the soup. You can have the birthright, Jacob. So Amalek becomes a type of flesh. And here we see the descendants attacking Israel for the first time. They will become perpetual enemies by attacking God's people again and again. What do we mean by referring to Amalek as a type of flesh? It means that they are following the evil, old, sinful nature that came to us through Adam, which we all have. No getting away from it. Talking of our natures, did you know that a believer has two natures? The old one and the new one. The old one that comes from Adam is inbuilt into us. The new one comes from Christ. In Galatians 5 it tells us that the flesh wars against the spirit and the spirit wars against the flesh. So these two natures are opposite or contrary to each other. Before becoming a Christian, you had no conflict at all. You were totally under the dominion of the flesh. You might not have known it, but you were. It was all about you. What shall I eat? What shall I drink? What shall I wear? What shall I do today? No conflict. Everything was centered on you. However, once you become saved, as wonderful as that was, after a while, you must have begun to notice something. There was a conflict going on, a battle going on between the old nature and the new nature. The flesh against the spirit against the flesh. Paul tells us in his letters that the things he doesn't want to do, he does. And the things he ought to do, he doesn't. It's a constant battle. The key here is that you have to build up either one or the other. You can't do both. You can't have a foot in both camps. So, build up the spirit by feeding the spirit using the word of God, by prayer, by fellowship. Then you will weaken the old nature, the flesh. So back to our story. The Israelites were still feeding their flesh, thinking back to the times in Egypt. But now they had a real problem to deal with. The Amalekites. Moses tells Joshua to gather together some of their men to fight the enemy, while he will go to the top of a hill to pray for victory. Now it's interesting that these Amalekites attacked from the rear. It doesn't tell us in this passage, but if you read in Chronicles, it tells us what they did. They attacked the weak at the back of the line. They attacked the weary, the stragglers. Isn't this just what Satan does to us, the church? The easy pickings first. We need to be on our guard all the time for the enemy. So Joshua went out to fight with the Amalekites, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up the hill. I'll pause there and I'll ask you a question. Who is Hur? It's not Ben-Hur. It's funny that it doesn't tell us this. So that tells us something about him. He must have been well known, because they just bring his name out. One of the chroniclers of the Jewish history, a guy called Josephus, he mentions him as being the husband of Miriam. Now Miriam was Moses' sister, so that meant that Hur was his brother-in-law. Okay, so Moses takes his family up with him to help. Moses took the staff so that the army could see him with it on the top of the hill. That's why he was up there. He wasn't back in his tent. He was at the top of the hill looking over the battle so that those down in the battle could see him on the hill. Remember that the staff that he took was like a symbol of God being with them. As Moses stood on the top of the hill, the scripture tells us that he held his hands up high in an attitude of prayer. So he was effectively doing this with his staff in his hand. Okay? Now then, when his hands were lifted up, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, then the Amalekites were winning. Israel wins, Amalekite wins. Israel wins. I wonder if he did a little test. Win, lose, win. But the problem is, he was getting tired. So it says they found a large stone for him to sit on. As he got tired, and Aaron on one side and Hur on the other held his hands up so they remained steady. For how long? Until sunset. Now, I don't know about what time the battle started, but that was probably early in the morning. So he'd been there all day with his hands held high. I think my hands would have wearied long before that. Seeing Moses on the hill with the staff raised up above his head would have encouraged those fighting the battle below. This shows the power of prayer in action. Incidentally, it doesn't tell us that he was praying. It just says he held his hands up. But in Jewish circles, the action of prayer is not like we do. But they don't put their hands together and bow their heads or kneel down. Praying for the Jewish community is holding their hands up and looking up, asking God what they want to ask, praising God. That's the way the Jewish people prayed. So this action of Moses standing on the top of the hill with his hands held high, they would know down below that Moses was praying for them. He was part of what they were doing. By the evening, the Amalekites were defeated by Joshua and his men. The Lord told Moses to write down on a scroll what happened so it could be remembered by everyone. Incidentally, did you notice in the reading that they told Moses to tell Joshua in particular? Why was that? Because Joshua was going to become the leader next, so he needed to know what had happened so that he could relate that to the people. Moses then built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." I wonder why he did that. That action of holding the staff above his head, what does it look like? It looks like a banner over Moses. Joshua was fighting the battle, and Moses was with him in that spiritual fight. Now then, we go to chapter 18. And that tells us an unusual story about Jethro, his father-in-law, visiting him. I wonder why they've put this in there. Moses had been doing everything himself up to that point. Although he was a strong leader, he'd not delegated anything to anyone else. He was like a one-man show. He was pastoring probably around 2.5 million people by this time, all by himself. Joshua fights the battles. Moses does all the spiritual work. Fortunately, he has a father-in-law who is very astute and smart and sees what's going on. This chapter is a great study in human nature and also administration and delegation. It says Jethro heard about what had happened and how the Israelites had escaped from Egypt, and about all that God had done for Moses and the people of Israel. So he sent word to Moses to tell him he was coming with his sons and his wife. That's Moses' sons and Moses' wife. So you might ask, well, why wasn't Moses' sons and his wife with him now? Well, do you remember way back when Moses came back from Midian? He brought his wife and his sons with him. That was after 40 years of working for Jethro as a shepherd. I suspect that on the way, he was probably thinking, what's going to happen next? I've got a job to do. I've got to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And I've got to face Pharaoh. And God's going to tell me what to do. And there's going to be terrible times. I don't think he wanted his wife and his sons there. So he sent them back to Jethro. And it says in our passage that Jethro had received them back. So they'd been living with Jethro all the while they'd been coming out of Egypt up to this point. So he sent word that Jethro's coming. And Moses goes out to greet him. He greeted him, and it says he bowed down before him and kissed him. How many of you have done that with your father-in-law or your mother-in-law? It's an interesting point. That made me chuckle, that did. Moses then takes him into the tent, and they talk about their experiences. Moses told him how they'd come out of Egypt and how God had blessed them and protected them up to this point. Moses was effectively witnessing to his father-in-law. And what was Jethro's response? He said, and we can read this in verses 10, chapter 18, Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. He, Jethro, had been converted and became a believer because of what he'd heard and seen. Jethro himself was actually a Midianite, a descendant from Abraham. But he didn't worship the true God. It says that he was a priest of Midian. But now he acknowledges that God is the one who is above all gods. And he's been converted. You know, there's nothing like your personal testimony. If you witness before friends and family, they know you. And if they can see the changes and see the evidence, then there is the greatest proof that they need. They may be skeptical, but they cannot doubt the changed life. The evidence is before them. Do you remember in Mark's Gospel, we read about a demon-possessed man who Jesus healed? He wanted to follow Jesus, but Jesus told him to go back home to his relatives and tell them everything that had happened to him. Start there and tell your own personal story. It's your story, and no one can dispute it. So Moses and Jethro have spoken and had a meal, and Jethro has sacrificed an offering to God. The next day, it's business as usual. The Amalekites have gone, and Moses is back to normal business. And Jethro is there watching what happens. Moses is now in court. He's probably sitting in a big fancy chair as a judge for all the people, with all their issues and problems to solve. You can imagine it, can't you? Being in a tent, and there's a long line of people stretching right outside the tent, waiting to see Moses, because Moses is the lawgiver. Moses is the one who talks to God. He will answer my problem. He tries to deal with this. This went on, it says, all day, from morning till evening. Jethro asked Moses why this was done, and he was told that the people come to Moses to inquire of God. Now then, here's the wise bit. Jethro says to Moses, "This thing you do is not good." I expect Moses probably thought that, Jethro will be pleased with me. He's seeing what a great job I'm doing, I'm the one who judges everything. I'm the one who speaks to God. He tells me what's needed. No, totally the opposite. This is not good. See what else he says in verse 18. You and these people who come to you will surely wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Can you imagine what it would have been like if you'd have been at the end of the queue, standing there all day? You'd have been totally exhausted by the time you got to Moses, if at all you did. Sometimes we can get so involved in doing things that we think nobody else can do it like us. But we just need someone to take us aside and help us to delegate. Can you imagine what sort of stuff Moses had to listen to as their judge? Yeah, he stole my sheep. He snores at night. His tent's too near mine. What a sensible guy this Jethro was. He could see that Moses would not last very long doing all this every day with all these responsibility. So Jethro suggests a plan to get a team together to share out the work. No person, no matter how gifted, can do everything on their own. There was a quote that I read from D.L. Moody, and it said this: "I'd rather find 100 men to do the work than to do the work of 100 men." Very wise words. So Jethro saw the problem and he acted on it. He acted on it for two reasons. Firstly, it would wear Moses out. And secondly, it would wear the people out. The plan was this. Moses should firstly get alone with God and get hold of God's principles. And then he was to teach the people. Get some qualified men to learn and be judges over the people, so that the great matters can be judged by you, Moses, and the smaller matters can be judged by these other men, and they will bear the burden with you. Is there not a parallel here in what we see happening in Acts chapter 7, where there's a dispute among the different groups about how they were being treated? So what did the apostles do? They told them to select 7 men full of spirit and good reputation to serve in the manner needed to solve that particular problem. So Moses chose able men out of all of Egypt and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s, so that they could judge the people at all times. Then Moses let his father-in-law go back to his own country. Great, the disorganization has been solved. And there, we'll have to leave it until next week, when we'll see what happens next. So, what can we take away today from this? Trust in God always and don't grumble. Feed your spiritual nature, not the flesh. And manage your time by what is important, not necessarily what you think is urgent. Let's read our motto, which sums it all up. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, I brought my Bible up and I prepared this message. And then this morning, in a reading, I read this, which I think is excellent. This is from Ephesians chapter 3. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. I thought that was very relevant. So now we're going to have Andrew come and give us the intercessory prayers, and then we shall have more of a worship time.